Hello, my name is Scott Schrader. I am the President and Program Coordinator for the Monroe County Civil War Roundtable in Bloomington, Indiana. Thank you for joining us for this presentation. Tonight, we have two contributors to this program. First is Colonel Keith Gibson. Colonel Gibson is the Executive Director of the VBI Museum System and Architectural Historian for the Virginia Military Institute. Joining Colonel Gibson tonight is Major Grace Abel. Major Abel is the Site Director for the Thomas Stonewall Jackson House, which is part of the VBI Museum system. This program is special, and we will get a chance to do a brief virtual visit to the VBI Museum, and is also an opportunity to try something new with our virtual programs. We hope that sometime in the future, we're going to try and organize a live program or a live visit to the VBI Museum. So hopefully this one will wet your whistle a little bit about some of the things that we're going to see. Colonel Gibson has offered our group the opportunity when we do a live visit to take us a little bit behind the scenes and maybe see some items that are not typically on display in the museum. So with that brief introduction to tonight's program, we're going to get started. So I'm going to welcome Colonel Gibson and Major Abel. And Colonel Gibson, if you can unmute your mic, then we'll go ahead and get started from there.
Has that magically happened?
You have magically unmuted. You are now with us. We can all hear you.
Thanks to my trusty assistant. It's a delight to be with you this evening. In fact, I was reflecting on the fact that over the past several decades, I've had the good fortune to travel around the country and a couple of foreign countries to speak to roundtables. And I was reflecting on or amusing myself with the fact that, well, this has been the shortest travel time that I've had, even though you are a bit far away. But delighted that you can join me and Grace this evening for a while at the VBI Museum. The VBI Museum is a special place for many reasons. One of them is that it is in fact the oldest public museum in the Commonwealth of Virginia. It dates back to 1845 in a state where history is very easy to find. That's quite, it's quite something. VMI itself, the Virginia Military Institute, the nation's first state-sponsored military college, had only been founded some 6 years earlier in 1839. But it was our founding superintendent's intention to have a place set aside where the young cadets, citizen soldiers in the making, would have examples of leadership and courage and military sacrifice and duty and accomplishment, all on their campus in front of them on a daily basis as reminders and as models. George Washington being among the most significant of those. In the VBI Museum here, we tell the story of that evolution from 1839 until the year 2000 in our cadet gallery. We have another gallery that is dedicated to a very important world-class collection of antique firearms, mainly they in fact do revolve around the revolving cylinder firearm that Colt, of course, as you know, made so popular and commercially successful. But it traces that whole evolution in a very methodical engineering sort of way. So it's used by, in fact, our engineering cadets in that regard. That's here for you to say. The gallery where we are located at the moment introduces folks to that fellow that's just been mentioned, Thomas Jonathan Jackson, who arrived in Lexington in the fall of 1851 after himself graduating from West Point in 1846. He was a bona fide war hero by then. He immediately left West Point, went to Mexico in the Mexican-American War, distinguished himself there. But by 1851, he's getting somewhat bored with his assignment in Florida, and he's looking for other opportunities. A letter arrives one day that he implied himself was divine intervention, and he takes the opportunity to come to this still pretty young military institution in Virginia, his native state, because, well, that was one of the reasons. He was getting back home. And his closest relative was just over the Allegheny Mountains, a little further to the west in what is now West Virginia. being at VMI would also keep him in a military lifestyle in a very real and practical way. So all those things appealed to him. And so he arrived that first fall of 1851 to teach a class he probably hadn't given a moment's thought since his West Point days as a cadet himself. But Jackson was quick to remind us, you may be whatever you resolve to be. So he resolved to be a professor of natural philosophy. And oh, by the way, he's going to teach artillery tactics too. There, no one questioned his abilities. But there are really two Jacksons here in Lexington, Virginia. There's that fellow in the Confederate uniform, Stonewall, as he becomes known around the world, the first really great hero of the Confederacy, if you think about it. When people are still referring to Robert E. Lee as Granny Lee, they're referring to him as Stonewall in the papers in Germany and England. But here in Lexington, he's not Stonewall yet. He's Major Thomas Jackson, upwardly mobile Victorian, a self-made man, establishing a family, a newlywed. In fact, twice he will marry in Lexington. A homeowner. He's very much like you and I. That's the Jackson that you will meet when you visit the Jackson house, where you might have the good fortune of talking to Grace or one of our guides on that subject. But in the VMI Museum, we recognize the fact that there are these two Jacksons. There's the Stonewall and there's the Major Jackson. We also tell that story of the two Jacksons in our museum exhibit gallery with the artifacts we have. You know, I mentioned that the museum collection has been developed since 1845. When those very first artifacts were accepted by the president of our college, the superintendent, as we refer to him, he wrote back to the donor and said, "These items will speak to future generations with a touching and eloquent voice." And that's sort of our mission statement. All of these thousands of artifacts that have come in over the years, and I'll introduce you to a few of them this evening, all of those artifacts are participants. They were a part of the moment that commemorates the individual whose service we remember yet today. As it relates to Stonewall Jackson, one of the things that does that eloquently is this blue officer's uniform. It's a regulation federal officer's uniform from the 1850s. He wore it in his classroom here at VMI. When he left VMI, he was still in the service of the Commonwealth of Virginia, not yet a Confederate officer per se of the Confederate Army. That would come slightly later. So he wears that uniform that had been a part of his service at VMI. He also takes away the desk that he had used in his classrooms. He's going to need that in the field. It's state property, so he's serving the state, so it seemed a reasonable thing to do. He, interestingly enough, takes this little stool here that on April the 21st, 1861, Jackson has been given the orders to take the cadet corps to Richmond. Actually, this will be his first role as an officer in the Army. He's going to take the cadets to Richmond to act as drill instructors for all of these green would-be soldiers that are pouring in to Richmond, Camp Lee, not because of Robert E. Lee, but because of the earlier Revolutionary Lee, as you probably recall. Well, he's out in front of George Washington's statue. I mentioned George Washington a few moments ago, how important that character of citizen soldier is to VMI. He's out in front of the barracks. The cadets have already formed up on that Sunday afternoon. Their order said they'd leave at 12:30. They're early. They're ready to go. Jackson arrives, and he's standing there literally in the shadow of the statue of America's Cincinnatus, the citizen soldier for our country. Imagine that scene for a moment. Jackson himself getting ready to march off to war with the cadets. The time is passing slowly. Someone goes down to the mess hall and picks up that stool and brings it up so Jackson can sit down and rest while he's waiting. And finally, the clock strikes 12:30, and Jackson stands and says, "The time has come." The stool gets thrown into the baggage wagon. Jackson boards his horse, mounts his horse, and turns to the cadets and gives his first command of the Civil War: right flank, forward march. Most of those cadets would return to VMI, but Jackson would not return to Lexington or his home or his wife. All of those dreams that he had had for that house on Washington Street here in Lexington would not come to be because of the intervention of fate in their life. But that's getting a little bit ahead of the story. Jackson's wearing that uniform at First Manassas when he's commanding the 1st Brigade, as you remember, those 5 regiments from the Commonwealth of Virginia. And he's there on Henry Hill and earns that nickname from Bernard B. There stands Jackson like a stone wall. He's wearing that uniform at that moment. Jackson's slightly wounded during that battle. It's his wife's birthday, by the way. He writes to her the day after the battle and said, "I was wearing your uniform yesterday during the battle." Was that a gift? Had she given them this uniform? And it was wounded, he told her in the letter, but it's undergoing surgery and is expected to return to service, sort of personifying the uniform as a good soldier. And the scars of that battle are still visible in the uniform jacket. That is just one part of the story, the alpha part. And if that's the alpha part, here's the omega, that raincoat there. Jackson wore that raincoat at least twice during his military career of the American Civil War. One was in April of 1863 at a little place called Guinea Station. He is very excited to be there because his wife and their new daughter, whom he has never met, are on their way up from Richmond by the train. So Jackson, as you might imagine, this expectant father, is sitting there by the rail side waiting for that train to steam in. Finally, it arrives. It's raining. Jackson has his slicker on, and he rushes into the car, only to realize before he picks up his daughter for the first time that he's all wet, and he can't pick up his daughter in that condition. So he has to deny himself that privilege of fatherhood until they go inside the house and he can take that dirty, wet raincoat off and hold his daughter for the very first time. Jackson was good at denying himself, however. I don't know how difficult that might have been for him. But the pride and the accomplishment, the sense of family that had eluded Jackson for most of his life. You remember, he was an orphan by the age of 7, raised by relatives. His first wife had died in childbirth, but now Jackson has a real family with Mariana and Julian. The next time we know of Jackson wearing that raincoat will be 6 short weeks into the future. It's May the 2nd, 1863, not too far away from Guinea Station, the Battle of Chancellorsville, a story that I'm sure most of you know as well as I. Jackson isn't feeling particularly well that day. Maybe he's coming down with the cold. He has a couple of shirts on and a jacket and that raincoat. It's about 9 p.m. It's probably Jackson's most successful single day on a battlefield. He's made that remarkable flanking march around the Federal Army and has rolled up the Union right flank. Jackson, as evening and darkness falls on his Mount Little Sorrow, is going forward in front of the lines with his staff. And as they return, they are mistaken as Union cavalrymen, and they're fired upon, probably by 18th North Carolina unit. Jackson is wounded 3 times in that volley of fire, once in the right hand, once in the left wrist, and one in the upper left, right near the socket joint of the shoulder, at the very top of his left arm. He's swept from Little Sorrow. The coat is cut off of him because they don't know how much damage has been done. They cut the coat off and they open the coat up, realize it's bleeding profusely. There will be an amputation that night. He's then taken away from the front of the battlefield to, well, that place at Chancellorsville called Guinea Station. and he's being attended by his personal physician, Hunter McGuire, and things are going pretty well. Jackson is doing well. About midweek, precipitously, Jackson begins to fail. And by the weekend, well, Mariana has been told of Jackson's wounding. She's making her way to his side. She's back there to help nurse him back to health at the Chancellor House at Guinea Station. But she's told by Dr. McGuire that it is not to be, that Jackson will most likely die of his wounds as complications had set in. She has a private gathering, a meeting with her husband saying, Thomas, I've been told that you will be with your Heavenly Father today. Her way of telling him that his wounds were mortal. And he takes it amazingly stoically, maybe like you would expect. He says, good, good. And then he says, today is Sunday. Isn't the day Sunday? She confirms that that day was Sunday. He says, very well, I always wanted to hope to die on Sunday. So these two uniforms speak of those incredibly poignant moments, touching and eloquent voices from the battlefield of Manassas, Stonewall, to the father holding his daughter for the very first time, to the mortally wounded commander of Robert E. Lee's Corps at Chancellorsville. Thousands of artifacts that tell similar stories. I've mentioned one of our artifacts a couple of times now. It's this guy here, Little Sorrel, Stonewall Jackson's favorite war horse, not his only one, but the one that if there was serious business to be accomplished, the one that Jackson would go and ask for. They had met up at Harper's Ferry. In fact, he came from your part of the world, somewhere out west there, not too far, Indiana, Ohio, somewhere in that area. We're not even sure. He was just on a Union B&O railroad train with a bunch of other horses that were destined to become property of the United States Army. Jackson commandeers that train, and they're taking the horses out, and Jackson is looking for maybe a mount for himself, and he sees this scraggly, barrel-chested, short-legged, not particularly inspiring mount, and he decides that that might fit Mariana. So he buys Little Sorrel to send back to his wife. Little Sorrel never makes it to Jackson's wife because there's some chemistry between the steed and the owner that takes place that made Jackson totally comfortable, totally reliant on this horse. Throughout the Valley Campaign of 1862, it's going to be on Little Sorrel that Jackson makes his major decisions and watches the battles unfurl here in the Shenandoah Valley. And it will be on Little Sorrel that Jackson finds himself on that fateful May of 1863 evening. Little Sorrel survives the war, by the way. He is sent back to Mariana. He's not much of he can't pull a plow. He can't be harnessed to a wagon. So he's really not much good on the home front. So Mariana actually offers him to VMI, for VMI to adopt the horse. And General Smith, the same person that had started the museum years earlier, said, sure, we'd love to have Little Sorrel. So he comes to live here on the VMI parade ground. Eventually, Little Sorrel finds his final home in the Old Soldiers' Home in Richmond, with a good large number of Confederate soldiers that took care of the horse in the horse's final years, maybe conjuring up memories of earlier battlefields. Little Sorrel is, at this point, well into his 30s, and his fate is inevitable and apparent. So a taxidermist is called, a guy named Frederick Weber, to come and prepare for the process of mounting the hide of Little Sorrel. That's, I think, is why Little Sorrel has a sort of reared head, startled look about him. You know, like, what are you doing? You know, what are you measuring for? Well, the end finally comes, and the hide is surgically removed from the body, and tanned accordingly. And Frederick Webster had just developed, he was a taxidermist with the Smithsonian, had just developed a new technique that allowed for the form of the horses to show their musculature in a much more natural way than had previously been capable of replicating. So he mounts the horse, and the horse goes back to the old soldiers' home and stays there until after World War II, at which time the last of the old soldiers was gone, and there was little sorrow. So he comes back to the Institute in those post-World War II years, and it's been a part of the museum ever since. We have the taxidermists today from the Smithsonian come down every decade or so and give him sort of a touch-up. The first time they did that, I might mention they were explaining to me the process that they would use to restore the horse. He had never been, up until this point, it had been 100 years since anyone had done anything to it. So they're explaining that first we'll take him outside and we'll hose him down with the garden hose. And I'm saying, whoa, wait a minute, you're gonna like. And he said, oh, don't worry about it. It'll be fine. We do this to our mounted hides all the time. Just don't worry about it. But in my mind, I could see every hair sort of floating down the drain and ending up in the local river, and the end of my career eminently in my future if that were to happen. But they assured me it was all right. So I allowed them, those professionals, to proceed. And they used a very special chemical in the process here too. It came in little green bottles, I remember. It was called Pert shampoo. They went out to the local Walmart and purchased it and used about 4 gallons on him, I think. And he smells wonderful, if you remember. I don't even think you can buy Pert anymore. But that is what the professionals use to help restore his hide so that we can have him here today. There are only about 12 historically significant mounted horse hides in the world. One of Napoleon's horses, a couple of race horses, famously Trigger from Roy Roger days, very rare internationally, and one of only about 2 or 3 in the United States that you can come and visit. Speaking with a touching and eloquent voice, a participant to those events. I want to show you a couple of other things in the galleries here, but I'm really looking forward to your coming and going through these spaces with us. In addition to the VMI Museum, we actually have a museum system here. Of course, the Stonewall Jackson House, as was mentioned, but we also have a 300-acre battlefield and a 19th century farm in Newmarket, Virginia. And on May the 15th, this time of year, in 1864, the Cadet Corps was called out to help defend the Shenandoah Valley. And in a critical moment of that battle, on a rainy Sunday afternoon, the cadets found themselves in the very center of the Confederate line. Fate really put them there, but they shored up a disunited Confederate line and then spearheaded a charge across a rain-soaked wheat field. 10 cadets would die as a result of their action there. 47 were wounded. It was a demonstration of the VMI citizen soldier. One of my favorite artifacts in our 20,000 plus piece collection is this set of handguns. These you might be able to recognize as Model 1851 Navy Colt revolvers. They're a brace of pistols. Their serial numbers are just separated by 1 digit. They were purchased to be in that case and presented to a VMI graduate, a member of the class of 1859, who after his graduation had stayed on at the Institute as a math professor. Joseph Chenoweth was his name. But when war starts, he feels compelled to help defend Virginia. So he makes it known that he is going to be resigning his position at VMI and joining now General Jackson in the Shenandoah Valley. When his cadets find out about that, they acquire this brace of pistols in their case. They have the top of the case engraved Lieutenant Joseph Chenoweth. And on the back straps of the pistols, they have Lieutenant Joseph Chenoweth from his cadet class 1860-61 as Chenoweth gets ready to leave. They felt an appropriate gift for their professor, for their officer. Chenoweth accepts the pistols and goes off and joins Jackson in the Shenandoah Valley. June the 9th, 1862, Jackson's forces are along a little riverbank in a place called Port Republic. Chenoweth gets up that morning. It's a Monday morning. He gets up that morning and he knows it's a day of battle. Troops are forming on the field to take their positions in line. Chenoweth reaches into that box and takes one of those pistols and puts it into his frock coat and goes out into the field. And before the day is over, Chenoweth is killed. His body's never recovered. It's still there to the best of anyone's knowledge. His belongings were packed up and they were sent to the Chenoweth family, including this box with one pistol. And ultimately the family moves to Wisconsin. They're doing genealogical research and they contact me and the museum to find out what we knew about Joseph Chenoweth, knowing that he had graduated from here and had been on the faculty. We told them the information that we had here, and almost in passing, one letter they suggested that, well, you know, the only thing that the family has of his is a little wooden box with his name on it, and inside that box is a pistol. And they almost embarrassingly said, it obviously once held two pistols. We don't know whatever happened to the other one. Well, when I read that, I immediately got back in touch with them and said, I can tell you what happened to the other one. In 1935, a VMI graduate in Norfolk, Virginia, down on the Chesapeake Bay, about 250 miles from the Shenandoah Valley, was rummaging around a junk shop. And he sees a pistol on the table and examines it and says, well, this might be worth taking home. And then he notices on the backstrap, Lieutenant Chenoweth from his VMI cadets, 1860-61. And he says, oh my goodness, VMI, well, I must buy that for the museum. And he does. It probably cost him $3 or $4. And he ships it off to the Institute, and it has been here ever since the 1930s on exhibit as an example, speaking about the relationship between a cadet and a professor. And that professor is called to duty. That was the voice that that pistol was echoing for all of those decades. Well, we didn't know there was another pistol, not until the family said, we've got a box and it has a vacancy in it. Well, when I told them that, the family got together and said, what should we do with our pistol in our box? And it became obvious to them it had to come back to Lexington. And on the anniversary date of that battle of June the 9th, 1862, the Battle of Port Republic, where Lieutenant Chenoweth lost his life, we brought those pistols back together so that they could be reunited in the place that they had started that incredible journey. You can see that the upper pistol has all of its original finish on it. It's walnut handles are still nice and bright, but the other pistol has lost its finish, has had much harder life throughout the decades. The walnut handles have darkened because of oxidation, but there they are back together. One silently waiting in that box all of those decades, the other roaming around the Commonwealth of Virginia until it was discovered and came home in the 1930s. What is the likelihood of that, of those pistols being separated in such a way and coming back together so they can be here to greet you when you come and tell their story of their part, their moment in history? Amazing. We're going to segue into the next part of the program that we want to present to you, and that will be a period where we will sit down in our library and do a question and answer period with you, discussing Jackson's legacy. We've talked something about how Jackson became a worldwide figure, noted in military circles around the world. But how that legacy of Jackson may be evolving in modern times, and we're very much a part of that conversation. As we move to the library, since we're passing right by here, I'd like to point this guy out. This is Professor John Brooke. If you know anything about the Monitor and the Merrimack, you might remember that John Brooke was the designer, one of the naval architects for the Merrimack, or more appropriately, the CSS Virginia, a naval architect, an oceanographer, and also developer of the Brooke gun, the naval ordnance. And this Japanese hakama, a man's trousers, were presented to him because he piloted, he was the navigator on the ship that brought the first Chinese emissary to the United States, to San Francisco, just before the American Civil War. Well, let's see if we can move into the library, and we'll do some resetting here. Let's see. I will get this over here. I don't know that we need the light on. I don't think we need the light on.
Well, Colonel Gibson and Major Abel are getting the camera reset a little bit for the next portion of the program. I'd just like to remind everyone that to remember, if you have a question, even as we go along, please feel free to put it in the chat function or the Q&A function. When we get to the part where people want to feel like they want to throw some questions in, we may start out here and ask a couple, but again, we'd love to have you guys chip in, and especially as we get into the discussion part here too. So I just wanted to throw that little reminder in as we're getting everyone into place here.
Can you see us and hear us?
Absolutely, we can see you great, and we can hear you just fine as well. I'm going to go ahead and start out with a question here. You had mentioned in the opening part with Thomas Jackson and how he got his famous moniker, Stonewall, was given to him by Barnard Bee. And I know there's a little bit of difference of opinion whether that was actually a compliment or a critique. And I would wonder if either of you guys might want to weigh in on what your feeling is on that.
Well, not surprisingly, we've had the opportunity to discuss that quite a bit over the years. I think it's a great story, and I think that there probably is some reason to believe that it wasn't quite clear, and there's a reason why there's confusion on that point. Of course, Barnard Bee is commanding. He's a brigadier also. He's commanding South Carolina troops there, and he's being pushed hard up Henry Hill, and he sees the Virginia flags of the Virginia brigade and knows that that's Jackson arriving on the field. He and Jackson have a bit of battlefield communication. Jackson is suggesting that he will hold the line where he is, like a Stonewall perhaps, and Bee's troops can find refuge and help reinforce that line. So Bee famously says to his troops, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall, rally around the Virginians." And just a few minutes later, within the half an hour, Barnard Bee suffers a mortal wound. The newspapers the following days will recount that story as they begin to call Stonewall by that pretty handsome nickname. Stonewall, of course, refuting that it was his or his alone, that it really belonged to his men of the regiments. In fact, was a bit reluctant to accept any praise particularly as it might appear in the newspapers, because he, as being a very pious Presbyterian, he felt that any accomplishment that he had was because of what God had allowed. So Jackson sort of is embarrassed, perhaps, a little bit about this newfound fame that begins to catch like wildfire and is being reported in papers north and south across the Atlantic Ocean. And unlike today, with our instant communications and CNN and Fox and any news agency, where they can ask for clarification and further explanation as to what some politician might say, there was no opportunity to go back to Bernard B. and find out exactly what he did mean when he said, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall." Well, what did he mean? There stands Jackson, impenetrable, resolved, committed, or there stands Jackson, not moving. Why isn't he coming down here to help us? Our South Carolinians are dying down here. So what was it? Well, it's the kind of thing that we in Civil War roundtables love to ponder. But the nickname, regardless, stuck with Jackson, not only through his life, but continuing on today. Some of Jackson's strongest fans were actually following his exploits in England, in the English press, and remain fascinated with Stonewall today. In fact, they routinely make tours to American battlefields where Stonewall fought and commanded. So which is it? Well, I don't have any idea which one it is. It's for each reader of history to muse upon. Although Grace may have solved this mystery, maybe I should ask Grace what was the real meaning there.
No solution here.
Oh well, there you go. So you're on your own out there, Lunda.
I've got another question here. I think I'm going to direct toward Major Abel. As the site director for the Jackson House, Jackson's time there was spent, like you said, primarily as an instructor for VMI. So can you tell us a little bit about how you interpret that particular site within the VMI Museum?
Yeah, so our site, we focus specifically on those 10 years he spent here in Lexington right before the war. So this is the time that he's really having a home, a permanent home in a town for the first time, because he was orphaned so young, he moved around, then he was in the Army. So we get to actually explore that personal side of Jackson with his first marriage that ended with the death of his wife in childbirth and the loss of a child. And then the sadness that he faced, making friends in town, marrying again, and really becoming an upwardly mobile Victorian in his time, a man who in many ways was very advanced for his time. So we're really one of the only sites that gets to explore that really personal side of his life.
Absolutely. We have a question here from one of our viewers. It says that I understand that Jackson taught some Bible study classes. Did he lead any such classes with the VMI cadets?
So he did teach students for a little bit of time. I know they were Washington College students, but I don't recall if he taught any with the VMI cadets at all. But he taught several Sunday school classes, including one for African Americans at the church that he had started, and that continued for many years after his death.
In fact, one of the reasons that he met his first wife, Ellie Junkin, was that her father was the president of then Washington College, today Washington Lee University, Presbyterians, and they, Dr. Junkin would have college students over to his house for religious study, for Bible study, and Jackson would join into those. And being a student at that time, older, but nevertheless a student of his religion, it's going to be in Lexington that he commits to his faith in such a strong way. particularly to Presbyterianism. He had actually leaned towards maybe Catholicism for a brief period of time. But in Lexington, the predominant denomination was Presbyterian. Scots-Irish is the origins of this part of the Shenandoah Valley. So he looks around him, this upwardly mobile Victorian, says, who are the most successful people in this community? They appear to be Presbyterians. And he committed himself to becoming one of those people, successful and a Presbyterian. And there's something else I'd like to mention about Jackson. And Grace said this so well. He was really advanced for his time. Jackson, even yet today, I have not successfully visited as many foreign countries as he had done in his, Jackson is dead by age 39. He will never reach his 40th birthday. But by that time, he had explored a good bit of Europe in 1856 on a tour. He knew several languages. This idea that he was this bumpkin from Western Virginia, orphaned and sort of passed around from family member to family member, well, part of that might be true. He had this burning inner passion that compelled him to better himself, which was not uncommon in his day for young men. They constantly read about how to improve themselves professionally and in their relationships with society. And Jackson was right in the thick of that self-improvement. He kept a little book called Personal, a book of maxims throughout, well, his West Point and his adult life. And in there, whenever he would read something about improvement and betterment, he would jot it down so that to reinforce that life lesson. The quote that appears in the arch as one enters the main arch of the VMI barracks today, it is emblazoned with, "You may be whatever you resolve to be." That's one of Jackson's quotes that he had read in his efforts to improve himself. So pretty sophisticated individual, this Stonewall Jackson, as it turns out.
Next question up here, we have one that asks, are there any living descendants of Stonewall Jackson?
Indeed.
Yes, there are many descendants. They're spread all throughout the US, and they keep in touch occasionally. But actually, when our museum was actually founded in the 1950s, Jackson's own granddaughter, who was raised by his widow, was a big contributor to the site. She gave us a lot of personal stories that she knew from her grandmother, and a lot of special items that actually belong to Jackson and his wife. So she was a very big supporter of our museum until her death at the age of 104 in 1991.
And I had the good fortune of knowing her, meeting her and talking with her on several occasions to get the idea of the intimacy of her relationship with her grandfather, who, of course, she never knew in life, but she almost did, because Thomas and Mariana Jackson have but one child that lives to adulthood, and that is their daughter, Julia, that Jackson had to remember the raincoat, and wanting to hold his daughter for the first time there at Guinea Station. She survives, lives to adulthood, marries, has a daughter of her own. But regrettably, she too dies young, even younger than her father. What was she, 28?
26.
26. This now motherless child is adopted by her grandmother, Mariana, widow of Stonewall Jackson. So she grows up almost as if she's another daughter of Mariana, and stays with her for the remainder of Mariana's life. She herself lives up well into the 20th century. So to meet that woman was a touchstone in many ways, not just for her family memories of her grandmother / mother, the person that raised her, but for her understanding. And, we should have asked her about what Bernard B. really meant. When she may have known.
If I might interject, this is John McGuigan. in the mid 1980s, while I was at the University of Virginia, I met a gentleman whose name was Thomas Jonathan Jackson Altizer, a noted theologian of the time who famously on the cover of Time magazine declared the death of God, which was somewhat ironic since he himself was descended from Jackson.
Yeah, fascinating. You can't choose your relatives. And that's the old saying.
Next one up. Jackson was known to be quite an eccentric character at times. We have an individual who asks that he had heard that Jackson had a practice of taking cold baths. What was his reason for taking these cold baths?
So Jackson was a big believer in hydrotherapy, or the water cure at the time. So he would visit hot springs on summer travels. And one of the things that was recommended, along with drinking 8 glasses of water a day, was to take daily cold baths, which not everyone took daily baths, but it didn't matter, summer, winter, you had to take a cold bath, and that was actually to help with circulation.
That, I remember, this is just a little offshoot, I remember that I believe Thomas Jefferson used to do that, not full body baths, but he would soak his feet in cold water every morning when he would awake for much the same reason.
Right. And Jackson's baths, he wouldn't have sat in a tub. It would have been much more of a sponge bath, but still very chilly morning experience.
Now,
It was
wasn't
not-
there- Oh, go ahead, Colonel Gibson.
Well, I was just going to expand on the whole idea of hygiene of the period, 1840s, 1850s, pre-germ theory. It was not certain that this water thing was beneficial. And who knows what the water contained. People didn't drink water the way we do today. They hardly ever stayed hydrated to the degree that we think is necessary. And they were more likely to get sick drinking the local water than they would be assisted by it. So apple cider, drinks of those natures were far more common and safer for the time. But this is another example of Jackson's betterment. He's looking for ways to improve himself in mind, spirit, and body. Grace also mentions the fact that Jackson, particularly in his married years, when class was over for the season, in fact, we're at that time right now, the cadets will be graduating here this weekend and going on summer furlough and returning in the fall. But as soon as Jackson was released from his duties here as a professor, they were out of Lexington, usually headed to Sarasota or the Springs in New York State, shopping in Philadelphia and New York, because the local furniture just was not good enough for those Victorians that wished to make an impression on their friends back here in Lexington.
To add a little bit onto the eccentricities of Jackson, there were stories, was it him that they said had sucked on lemons also, that he had done that? And I had heard at one time Bud Robertson say that was an absolute myth. So I'd like to hear what you guys think about that.
Well, I, not being one to disagree with one of my mentors, I think Bud had good logic when he questioned the availability of citrus fruits, certainly during the Civil War era. And Bud speculated that probably Jackson had to content himself with peaches most of the time, which are very common, particularly here in the Shenandoah Valley. But I have another theory of how Jackson, if it is true that he sucked on lemons to the degree that, and I shared this with Bud, it did not make it into his biography, so that tells you something right there. But if it is true that in so many observances of Jackson sucking on lemons, I can only, well, Jackson's a general officer, a very prominent general officer, lieutenant general, and generals have staffs that do virtually everything that you can imagine, short of making decisions. They write the correspondence, they write the reports, they prepare the uniforms, they make sure meals are prepared, the logistics, they take care of all of that. All of these aids. Modern day, you will have an aide that drives you, does your communications. So my theory was that Jackson had a lemonade that provided these citrus fruits for him. And now you know why it didn't make it into his biography.
Yeah. Next question up. Moving toward Jackson's military career from his other eccentricities, were there particular military leaders who Jackson admired?
One leader in particular was Napoleon. Of course, at West Point as a cadet, they would have learned Napoleon tactics. So that was one in particular that he really admired. You may have some other.
Absolutely, Napoleon. In fact, I have spent some time in my own military research of Jackson, integrating Napoleonic tactics, not lining up shoulder to shoulder, but how Napoleon moved and used his troops in comparison to how Jackson did that, and what moments that Jackson might have known from Napoleon's campaigns that we can see reflected in Jackson's movements. And particularly in the Valley campaign, there is a close association with one of Napoleon's movements where he intentionally divided his army, struck his opponent at one point, and then at another point with these numerically weaker forces, but it was such a shock and surprise, it was successful. Jackson is going to do the same thing at that battle that we mentioned earlier, at the Battle of Port Republic, where Jackson had separated his troops with the intention of ultimately bringing them back together, but it separated his troops to keep his opposing forces from joining their numerically superior numbers in his front. And he was successful at that at the Battle of Cross Keys, June 8th, 1862, and the sister battle of June 9th, 1862 at Port Republic. These twin battles that were the culminating battles of Jackson's Valley campaign. This idea of lightning-like movements, using geographical features to his advantage, all of those things are things that Napoleon was familiar with and used whenever he could. You might, I'm going to move the camera here just so you can see that, speaking of Napoleon, we have if you can see that very large portrait that is awaiting to go to be restored, roughly 9 feet by 6 feet, of Napoleon returning from his first visit to Elba, and he's coming back to France to claim his position as emperor. But the king had found out that Napoleon was on his way to Paris, and so he sends the 5th Regiment, the king's men, down to meet Napoleon in a mountain pass. This is a story Jackson would have known well, because a pass is a natural constriction for movement, particularly for armies. And so the 5th Regiment sets itself up in this mountain pass, and Napoleon has to come that way, and so he does. And when he sees the king's men there, Napoleon walks out in front of his troops and says, "You're here to kill your emperor. Here I am." And of course, they began to kind of look down at their feet and shuffle around a little bit, sort of embarrassed, and began to assure Napoleon that, no, we're here to join you. We're not here to kill you. And they do. They join Napoleon's troops, and they march triumphantly into Paris. And Napoleon declares himself emperor within, I can't remember at the moment whether it's 3 or 6 months, but within a very short period of time, Napoleon will fight the Battle of Waterloo, which changes the course of European history.
Tagging a little bit onto the topic of military tactics, we of course have our counterfactual question that is probably always asked. You've probably heard it 1,000 times. You probably know what I'm going to ask. So we have a what if question from one of our viewers. How might things have been different if Jackson had been at Gettysburg?
before I leave it to you.
Well,
And let's keep it to 500 words, because we know that there have probably been books written about that topic, right?
well, one way or the other, it would not have been good. I will go out on a limb and say that. The only two options that I can see as the outcomes of that, and people have spent an enormous amount of time ruminating and debating that question. If Jackson had been successful at Gettysburg, and Jackson was pretty successful, as you remember, at Antietam, what was the outcome there? But at Gettysburg, if Jackson had been successful at Gettysburg, certainly Jackson the battle would have evolved differently, because Jackson would have been forcing his men, determined, not hesitating, pressing forward. And yes, I am saying something in contrast to James Longstreet there. It could be reasons Longstreet didn't move with more clarity than he did, but that's a different topic. Would things have been different for the Confederacy if Jackson had been at Gettysburg? Let's say there had been a Confederate victory at Gettysburg. Would that have bought the South the time needed for some sort of negotiated peace? Would that have convinced the Europeans once and for all that it was time to join the Confederates in their cause for independence and nationhood? Would thousands of more Union and Confederate soldiers have died in the process while we were waiting for that outcome? The blessing might be, and it's heresy for me to perhaps even suggest this, but the blessing might be that Jackson wasn't at Gettysburg in terms of how our history will evolve. But even if we paint the scenario of military victory in Pennsylvania, then we have to conjecture further to make something of that victory. It's very difficult, and I'm not sure. I think we probably should be content with the way that fate worked that particular moment in our history.
Let's take a little turn here now from the 19th century into the 21st century. Let's talk a little bit about how have current events, with the way that we're currently relooking at history, maybe from a new perspective, and how has that led to the ways maybe VMI is either changing how they reinterpret or changing things around campus at VMI with respect to Stonewall Jackson and some of the other soldiers that may have come through VMI?
Well, that is something that we are studying and determining. It was almost not a choice for VMI to revere Jackson, almost at the exclusion of even other Confederate heroes one might point to from VMI, because Jackson was so venerated around the world. Today, this evening, if your participants were to Google, don't do it right now because you'd have to get off the site, but if you were to Google top 100 greatest military leaders of all time, you're going to come up with several lists, because historians will not ever agree on a single list. Everyone has their own opinions, so people rank people differently. But every military leader from Genghis Khan to today, you will find Stonewall Jackson, Thomas Jonathan Jackson, on all of those lists. He's usually around 35, 42, 49. He's right there in the top 50 of military leaders from around the world throughout history. That's pretty amazing that's pretty rarefied. Robert E. Lee, by the way, is always most often found up in the teens, 20, 25. So he rates a little higher than Jackson, but there's Jackson and all of those lists. It was almost, so with that kind of recognition, it was all but inevitable that VMI would become the place, in as much as Jackson's home, the only home he ever owned, was here. Jackson is buried here. That this connection between our somewhat awkward professor and the man that became Stonewall would be intertwined here. Jackson never had the opportunity to be Stonewall in Lexington, even though he intended to return to his classroom here after the war. Today, we are assessing those ways in which Jackson's legacy can still be found on our campus today. And by the way, I would mention also that in deference to the other over 250 VMI alumni who perished in the American Civil War, and some high-ranking Robert Rhodes, for example, Robert E. Lee had said, if I fall, you need to consider that guy to take my place, VMI graduate, and so many more. They clearly made their mark, but almost in deference to Jackson, Jackson is the one that is most prevalent here, even though West Point graduate, not really a product of the Institute per se. The arch that I mentioned that has his quote, the arch that bears his name, the building that we're in, Stonewall or Jackson Memorial Hall, the statue of Jackson that stood in front of the barracks, a number of ways. The Jackson Hope Medal that's given for the highest ranking academic graduate every year, by the way, provided by funds generated by British admirers of Stonewall Jackson, who gave those funds to create that medal, that award. There's so many ways that Jackson has been commemorated at the Institute. So today, as we began to reflect upon Jackson's legacy for the 21st century, as our country engages in a very important conversation about whose and history and how we take a meaningful history and put it into action in our own lives in the 21st century. What are the roles of Thomas Jackson in that? Some great lessons of Thomas Jonathan Jackson are found in his home. And that, as we have been reviewing and developing a strong storyline around that Jackson, the determined individual who sought to improve himself, to understand the world around him. Jackson, however, owned slaves. So that makes him a horrible person, because Jackson owned slaves. We must purge him from the landscape. Well, we must reflect on that topic, absolutely. It is intriguing to me that the very first slave that Jackson owned was a enslaved young man who came to Jackson and requested that Jackson purchase him. Jackson was a bachelor. He has no purpose, no function for particularly a male slave. But this slave, his name is Albert. Albert said, I want you to, if I must be owned, I want you to own me. But I also want you to give me the opportunity to earn my freedom, to buy my freedom for you, for what the value is that you will pay. Jackson entered into that business agreement willingly. I've always felt that so doing, Jackson was acknowledging the humanity of Albert and saw him as having a right to his person, to his destiny, to his freedom. And Jackson was willing to enter into that bargain. And ultimately, Albert, in fact, does gain his freedom by working and Jackson being paid back for his investment in Albert. A complicated relationship existed between Jackson, Thomas, Mariana, and the 6 enslaved people that lived also in that house with them. And that is really a richer, in some ways, more compelling story when we reflect upon the life of those newlyweds starting out their life together. We want to make room on the landscape for the many amazing, incredible stories of leadership and heroism that certainly VMI has amassed over the decades. Our cadets at Newmarket are another example of that. They fought for Virginia, thus they fought for the Confederacy. But when we think of them, we think of young men who rose, not seasoned soldiers, but young men who rose to a challenge that no one would have imagined. They, including the commanding general on that battlefield for the Confederacy that day, he put the cadets in knowing that there was no hope otherwise. It was truly a Hail Mary pass. He thought he was sending them to their death. Yet they rose to the occasion. Young people made the difference between victory and defeat on that battlefield because of their commitment to one another and their determination to achieve the goal that was set before them. Those are the things that we remember when we think of the cadets that fought in gray uniforms on that battlefield in May of 1864, a date that will be commemorated in just a few days. In fact, we'll be doing a live Facebook presentation from the battlefield at the very moment that the cadets charged across the field, 2 p.m. this coming Saturday, May the 15th. And you can go to the Virginia Museum of the Civil War Facebook page and find out all about that.
So it says we're running up on time. That's the perfect segue into our last question here. VMI has certainly commemorated the Battle of Newmarket over many, many, many years. And can you talk a little bit about what that commemoration has looked like in the past and maybe what it looks like today?
Well, very quickly, when I was a cadet, which is some time ago now, the focus was on really the cadets who died there, the 10 cadets who gave their life, boys, really, all teenagers, that struggled to make it across that field. The Corps would form up in a very special parade, a very moving parade, would form up, and their names would be called out. And as each of those 10 names were called out, someone in the ranks of the Corps would say, "Died on the field of honor, sir." And the next name was called out, and "Died on the field of honor, sir," until all those names were called out. By the way, that's a tradition that Napoleon Bonaparte himself started with one of his regiments when the colonel of the regiment was killed. Napoleon said his name will forever be on the records, and whenever we muster and call the roll of the regiment, we will call his name and respond, "Died on the field of honor, sir." That's the origins of that tradition at VMI. Napoleon himself, Jackson would be proud of that. He would have enjoyed that. About 5 or 6 years ago, we broadened that message and remembrance to include the just short of 600 VMI alumni who have died in times of national conflict, who have been killed on battlefields around the world throughout the history of the Institute, from the Mexican-American War till the global war on terrorism. This year, something different is actually taking place for the first time. There's always a formal parade at 2 p.m., the very time the cadets were charging across the battlefield. And this year, an hour earlier, selected cadets will form up in their dress uniforms and stand in front of a microphone with the speakers directed across the parade ground, and they will solemnly read the names of all of those 600 alumni from the Mexican-American War to the war, the global war on terrorism. It will take well over an hour to do that, but they will read every one of those names, giving a moment of recognition to all of those alumni who have followed in the footsteps, in a way, of those cadets from the battle at Newmarket. And I can assure you, a member of the class of 1968 that might be out for that memorial parade this year, as he's there and he reads the name of his roommate, for example, that didn't come home from Vietnam. Or there's a member of the class of 2013 who hears the name of his brother Rat that he struggled through the rat line with and didn't come home from Afghanistan. We are broadening the story to include that much grander contribution that the VMI citizen soldier has made, of which the Newmarket cadets are a solid and ongoing, continued into the future cornerstone of that legacy.
Very good. We'll wrap up, I think, there for tonight. Thank you so much, Colonel Gibson and Major Abel. We really appreciate your being with us here tonight with certainly for us, a unique presentation, not only because we have speakers from so far away, but we had some wonderful camera work by Major Abel doing some roving through the museum and into the library and everything else. We really appreciate that. And we really hope that we can follow up as a group or in smaller groups and individuals and come out and visit you at VMI and the VMI sites throughout the museum system. Thanks again for being with us tonight.
You're most welcome.
And from there, we will finish up. Thank you so much, and we hope to see you next time.